I love creating collages. I find it so relaxing to take some of my old prints or my paintings and just see what happens when I start to rip up the pieces and cut them and try to make sense of all these different textures and colors and things that I have. So I'll take old paintings that I've done, sometimes from teaching, or I'll make collage elements, and what I like to do is just to start to cut shapes and just see what comes. So I'll cut, I'll let the scissors almost be like my drawing mechanism. So I'll just draw with my scissors these different shapes, and I just start playing around with putting them down on the paper. And I don't really have a rhyme and reason a lot of times when I'm working on these collages. I sometimes think of them as collage incubation. I'm just kind of playing with shape, playing with color. I get my watercolors out. I move the shapes around on the page, knowing that they're probably not going to stay there, but they just start to activate the page in an interesting way. And so I love to look at that and see what happens. So, the white page, is broken up, and I start to play with just the composition. And I always have a lot of media around me. I have my watercolors, my watercolor pencils, my oil sticks, my crayons, my pencils. I just, probably have, 10 different media, different colors, and I just start playing. I put down some watercolor, I put down just some wash, and I don't necessarily know right away what colors will end up being in the piece, but I tend to have colors that I go to, like, a turquoise or an orange. I tend to stay away from purple for some reason, but I do just like to kind of play and see what's going to unfold on the surface. So I will kind of play with the edge of where the water meets the dry paper. I like to see just the happy accidents that occur. So dots, dashes, bumpy lines. I'll just play with it all, just letting myself get into the flow of the piece, not knowing where it's going to go to, and just taking some time to experiment and play and explore. And just seeing shapes unfold, unravel, unfold on the paper. Love using the watercolor pencils, put it in the dry and the wet to see what happens. And I like just the wet and the dry, and not necessarily knowing what is going to be happening on the page. I like bringing in other materials as I work. So I love to pick up like a watercolor crayon, maybe use some crayon, and then I get that great resist that happens. So I love doing that, of having resist happen in a piece. So when you use an oil pastel, you can get the watercolor to resist if you paint on top of it. And I love that action in a painting. I like the resisting. I like the different media, the juxtaposition of different media and textures and shapes. And so I'm always playing with that in all my collages. I really try to juxtapose just kind of a different feeling from the flatness of maybe a brush stroke to like the textured area of oil pastel. And I like to just mix it up a lot. Like I said, I always go with a process approach. I'm always doing things not knowing what the outcome will be. I like to respond to things on the page, and I get this kind of gut feeling of like, okay, does this work? Doesn't this work? If it doesn't work, that's okay too. I like to just see what unfolds and how I respond in the moment. So there might be pieces that I hate when I make them, and they never resolve and they don't work out, and that's okay. It's all about process and discovery and play and experimentation, because every time you do a piece, you're learning something new, and that will carry into the next piece. And having done this now for decades, for a long time, I know that even in the times where I'm making pieces that don't work or I don't like, or there's something that's just, quote, wrong with them, I'm still learning from the experience. And so every art piece kind of builds on each other. It is a process. It's an unfolding. And when you're in this long enough, you can kind of go through these different experiences and these different kind of, discoveries, and then you move on to the next piece. So you're never, stuck in a way. Everything's building off the last thing. And that's what I love about being an artist, is that it's constantly growing and changing, and it is this unfolding of learning something new each time you come to the blank white page or the blank canvas or whatever you're working on. I'll never make the same piece twice. I always bring my history in that moment, how I'm feeling, what the day is like, what I've learned about in my world or on the news. Everything's coming into the process as I'm working. So I love that. I love that I'm not going to necessarily know what's going to happen when I'm working on the page. And I just start to glue things. When I glue something down and I'm kind of committed to that thing being there, and then I keep working around it, I don't usually move it. And like I said, if it's, quote, a mistake, it might help me discover something new if I let it be. And so each of these marks on the page, each shape, each brush stroke, leads me to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And I love that about being an artist. And with all of these elements, I have a giant collage drawer of old paintings, old prints, old, just things that I keep and collect that I've made, and maybe they didn't work out. And then I use those, like this is a piece that is done on an old dictionary. I think it's a French dictionary. And I like to draw on old books and old phone books. And so then I'm just playing with, okay, how is this going to work? Maybe it won't work in the composition and I don't use it, but maybe it will as a shape or a texture, and I'll play with it, and I'll commit, I'll glue it down. I'm not using fancy materials here. I'm using Elmer's glue and, not super fancy. Like these are kind of like sketch collages, I think of them. They're getting me to think, to discover, what I'm trying to say with my work. And sometimes it's very unconscious, and it's very much about the process over the product. And I'm just seeing what kind of comes out on the page. I also like to pay attention to detail. Like I like to have little details, but then big swash areas where it's kind of a play between the detail and the bigger areas. The resist and then the flat areas. I really am always trying to find ways that things can play off of each other, so then your eye travels through the piece. I love using that resist again with complementary colors. So I have the orange laid down in Craypaw, and then bringing the watercolor in with either a blue, a dark purple, or dark blue. So I am always kind of just experimenting, and when things don't really go the way I want, or I find that what I'm working on is not working, especially when I'm using watercolor, I'll just grab like a paper towel, dab off the areas that I don't really like, or that I think, it's just too much. And so I'll knock it back with like just a paper towel or a dry sponge. I like to really, use things I have around the house, like Q-tips or, sponges that I cut up, just anything, knives, palette. Instead of always buying a palette knife, you can use the plastic knife with acrylic. So I'm always, looking at what I have in my environment, out in nature, using pine needles to get great marks. And again, I love just getting into the flow of that fluid watercolor paint or gouache. Here I'm using watercolor today, and just seeing what happens. Sometimes I tend to over mark, put marks in every area in the eye. Doesn't have a lot of resting places, so I try to think about that as well as I'm exploring what I'm making. But just responding, it's very much of a gut thing. When you get to a point when you've made art for so long, there's something that happens that's very intuitive. You get into that flow state where you're not really thinking, you're letting the piece speak to you, and you can kind of feel it in your gut if it's working or if it's not, if the colors are working, if the shapes are working. If it's not working, how can I fix it? You're always kind of talking to yourself somewhat in like this intuitive way of like, what if I do this? Let's try this. What if I put this over here? Oh, that's not really working. And it's not like you're really talking, but it's so second nature to a point that you're just responding and going back and forth and back and forth. And that's kind of the beauty of making art when you've done it for a long time, is that you have this like inner intuitive dialogue that is really exciting to work with. Putting colors down. Do they work? Don't they work? If it doesn't work, how can I shift the color a little bit? I always try to not use colors right out of the tube. I try to mix them to make them my own colors. There's an infinite way to mix different kinds of colors. I try to layer them. Always thinking about ways to make something uniquely my own. I think that's how I've developed my own style for so long. It's like, how can I use color in a way that's mine, that is uniquely mine, and how can I put a mark on the page? So, as you're creating as an artist, like what are the things that you can do that, as you're exploring, kind of speak to you? I always say to my students, there are no mistakes, only possibilities. No mistakes, only possibilities. Just see everything as a potential, even if it feels wrong, even if it feels like a mistake. How could you make that mistake into a new discovery, into something that takes you into a direction you couldn't even have imagined? That's such a new thing. So again, I like to get that craypa in because I'm going to do some more resist. I like to always work with some figurative elements. Even if I start abstract, I always go back to some figurative elements being in my piece. I am drawn to the figure, to eyes and hands and faces. I like the interest of that, the stories that we can tell. The expression, the communication, like old hieroglyphs on a cave. What comes out? What do we see? What story do you as a viewer bring into my work? Do I leave hints? Do I have even my own idea of what my work is about? Probably not. I'm just working, like I said, from an intuitive process place, so I don't always know what's going to happen on the page. And I want to just encourage you to pick up a pencil, pick up a brush, pick up some crayons, a crayon, a marker, and just see where your line will take you. What will you discover if you just trust your line? Just bring your line into the world. What will you discover about the world, about yourself? Do you feel calmer after you paint? If you want to work with me, I have many classes I offer. I have a Draw Everyday membership, and you just get a prompt in your email every day, and the audio from me where I'm just talking to you through that day's prompt. Art is never ending. You can find little pockets in your day always to do some art. So thank you for being with me today. I hope I brought you a little calm and a little art to your day.